The dust kicked up around Grace Abbott's worn boots as she stood at the edge of the cemetery outside Bannack, Montana, staring at a headstone that had weathered 3 winters since she last allowed herself to feel anything at all. It was April of 1876, and the spring thaw had turned the ground soft beneath her feet. Grace was 24 years old, though she felt ancient. Her late husband Thomas had been in the ground for nearly 4 years now, taken by a fever that swept through their homestead one brutal winter. Since then, she had learned to exist rather than live, running the small boarding house in town that barely kept food on her table and a roof over her head. Love was something she had buried alongside Thomas, and she had no intention of digging it back up. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine from the mountains and something else, something that made her turn her head toward the road leading into town. A rider was approaching, sitting tall in his saddle, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. Grace watched him for a moment, then turned back to the grave, placing the wildflowers she had picked on her walk up the hill. "Goodbye, Thomas," she whispered, the words feeling hollow even as she spoke them. She said them every time she visited, more out of habit than sentiment. The truth was, she barely remembered what it felt like to love him anymore. The memories had faded like old photographs left too long in the sun. By the time Grace made it back to her boarding house on Main Street, the rider she had seen had already tied his horse to the post outside. He was tall, she noticed, with broad shoulders and an easy way of moving that suggested confidence without arrogance. His clothes were dusty from travel, his leather vest well worn but cared for. "Can I help you?" Grace asked, climbing the steps to her porch. The man turned, and she found herself looking into the clearest blue eyes she had ever seen. He was young, probably around 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. "Yes, madam," he said, his voice deep and warm. "I am looking for a room. Name is Garrett Dawson. I will be working at the mine for a while, and I heard you rent rooms." Grace nodded, keeping her expression neutral as she unlocked the front door. "I have one available. $3 a week, includes breakfast and supper. You are responsible for your own washing." "That sounds fair," Garrett said, following her inside. The boarding house was modest but clean. With lace curtains Grace had made herself and furniture that had seen better days but was still serviceable. She led him up the narrow staircase to the second floor, where 3 bedrooms sat side by side. Only one other was currently occupied by a prospector named Henry who kept mostly to himself. "This one is yours," Grace said, opening the door to a small room with a single bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. The window overlooked the street below. "Breakfast is at 6, supper at 7. I expect my boarders to be respectful and quiet after 9. Garrett set his saddlebag down and looked around the room, then back at her. "This will do just fine, Mrs. Abbott," Grace said, "but you can call me Miss Abbott. I am widowed." Something shifted in Garrett's expression, a softness that appeared around his eyes. "I am sorry for your loss." Grace had heard those words 1,000 times, and they always rang hollow. But something in the way Garrett said them, with genuine feeling rather than polite obligation, made her pause. She cleared her throat. "Supper will be ready in a few hours. You can wash up at the pump out back." She left before he could respond, retreating to the safety of her kitchen, where she could busy her hands with cooking and push away the strange flutter she had felt in her chest when he looked at her. Over the next few days, Grace found herself acutely aware of Garrett's presence in her house. He was different from the other men who had rented rooms from her over the years. He helped her carry water from the well without being asked. He complimented her cooking with enthusiasm that seemed genuine rather than flattering. He spoke to her like she was a person, not just the widow who ran the boarding house. On the fourth morning of his stay, Grace was out back hanging laundry when she heard the sound of hammering. She walked around the side of the house to find Garrett on a ladder, repairing a loose shutter that had been banging in the wind for months. "What are you doing?" she asked, shielding her eyes from the morning sun. Garrett looked down at her and smiled. "Fixing this shutter. It was keeping me up at night." "You do not have to do that," Grace said. "I will get to it eventually." "I know I do not have to," Garrett said, driving another nail home, "but I wanted to. Besides, it only took a few minutes." Grace watched him work, noting the easy strength in his movements, the way his shirt stretched across his back. She realized she was staring and quickly looked away, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you," she said quietly. Garrett climbed down from the ladder and wiped his hands on his pants. "You are welcome. If there is anything else that needs fixing around here, I am happy to help. I am good with my hands." There was nothing suggestive in his tone, but Grace still felt that flutter again, that strange awakening of something she thought had died years ago. She nodded quickly and retreated back to her laundry, her heart beating faster than it should. That evening at supper, with just the three of them at the table, Henry the prospector barely looked up from his plate as he shoveled food into his mouth. But Garrett ate slowly, savoring each bite, and asked Grace about Bannack. "How long have you lived here?" he asked, cutting into the roasted chicken she had prepared. "All my life," Grace said, sitting at her usual spot at the end of the table. She did not usually eat with her boarders, but Garrett had insisted there was plenty of room, and it seemed silly for her to eat alone in the kitchen. "I was born just outside town. My parents had a ranch, but they sold it after my father got sick. They moved to Virginia City to live with my sister." "But you stayed," Garrett observed. Grace nodded, pushing potatoes around her plate. "I married Thomas Abbott when I was 19. He wanted to stay in Bannack. He had dreams of striking it rich in the mines." She paused, the old bitterness creeping into her voice. "He never did." "I am sorry," Garrett said again, and once more it sounded like he meant it. Grace looked up at him, really looked at him, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. It was not pity exactly, but something deeper. Understanding, perhaps. "It was a long time ago," she said, which was not quite true but felt like the right thing to say. "Time does not always heal the way people say it does," Garrett said quietly. "Sometimes it just makes things distant." Grace felt something crack inside her chest, something she had kept carefully sealed for years. "Yes," she whispered. "That is exactly what it does." Henry finally looked up, grunted something that might have been thanks for the meal, and left the table. Grace and Garrett sat in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken things. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said finally. Grace tensed. "I suppose." "Why do you live like this?" he asked, gesturing around the modest dining room. "Like you are just going through the motions." The question should have offended her, should have made her angry. But instead, Grace felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Because," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I do not know how to do anything else anymore." Garrett reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "Maybe you could learn," he said gently, "if you wanted to." Grace looked at his hand, so close to hers, and felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to take it. But fear held her back, fear of what it might mean, fear of letting herself feel again. "I should clean up," she said, standing abruptly and gathering plates with shaking hands. Garrett helped her despite her protests, carrying dishes to the kitchen and even pumping water for washing. They worked in silence, but it was not uncomfortable. Grace found herself stealing glances at him, noticing small things. The way he rolled up his sleeves, revealing tanned forearms. The small scar above his left eyebrow. the way he hummed quietly as he worked. "Where are you from?" she asked as she scrubbed a plate. "Colorado originally," Garrett said, "but I have been moving around since I was 18, working ranches mostly, sometimes mines. I go where the work is." "Do you have family?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Had," he said finally. "My parents and younger sister died in a fire when I was 20. I have been on my own since then." Grace stopped washing and turned to look at him. "I am sorry." "Thank you," Garrett said, meeting her eyes. "It taught me something, though. It taught me that life is too short to spend it not really living. My father always said tomorrow was not promised, and he was right. I try to make the most of every day now." "That must be nice," Grace said, turning back to the dishes. "To have that kind of freedom." "It is not about freedom," Garrett said. "It is about choice. You can choose to keep living even after you have lost everything." Grace felt those words settle deep in her bones. Could she choose that? After years of just existing, could she choose to actually live again? The days turned into weeks, and spring settled fully over Bannack. The mountains shed their snow, revealing green slopes dotted with wildflowers. The creek that ran through town swelled with runoff, and the air smelled of new growth and possibility. Garrett continued to fix things around the boarding house. He repaired the front steps, replaced missing shingles on the roof, and built a new gate for the back garden. Grace protested at first, insisting she could not afford to pay him for the work, but Garrett refused any payment. "Consider it a thanks for putting up with me," he said with a grin that made her stomach flip. They fell into an easy routine. Garrett would leave for the mine before dawn and return in the late afternoon, dusty and tired. He would wash up at the pump, then find Grace wherever she was working and help her with whatever needed doing. Sometimes they talked, sharing stories about their pasts, their hopes for the future. Sometimes they worked in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. Grace began to notice changes in herself. She found herself humming as she cooked, looking forward to mealtimes when Garrett would sit across from her and make her laugh with stories from the mine. She started taking more care with her appearance, pinning her honey-colored hair in a softer style and wearing her better dresses more often. One evening in late May, after supper, Garrett asked if she would like to take a walk. Henry had already retreated to his room and the dishes were done. Grace hesitated, her old fears rising up, but then she remembered what Garrett had said about choice. "All right," she said, surprising herself. They walked down Main Street as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The town was quiet, most people already home for the evening. Grace was acutely aware of Garrett walking beside her, their arms nearly touching. "Tell me about your husband," Garrett said as they reached the edge of town. "If you want to." Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering. She had not really talked about Thomas in years, not beyond the basic facts of his death. "He was a dreamer," she said finally. "Always chasing the next big strike, the next opportunity. He was kind, but he was never really present, if that makes sense. His mind was always somewhere else, somewhere better than where we were." "That must have been lonely," Garrett said. "It was," Grace admitted. "I loved him, or at least I thought I did, but looking back now, I am not sure I really knew what love was supposed to feel like. We married young, and I was just happy someone wanted me. After he died, I convinced myself that I had lost my great love, that I would never feel that way again. It was easier to believe that than to admit that maybe what we had was not enough to begin with." Garrett stopped walking and turned to face her. They were at the edge of the cemetery now, the same place where Grace had been standing the day he arrived in town. "Grace," he said, and the way he said her name made her breath catch. "I think you are wrong about that." "About what?" "About never feeling that way again. About love being over for you." He took a step closer, and Grace could see the intensity in his blue eyes. "I think it is just beginning." Grace felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Garrett, I know I have only been here a few weeks," he continued, "but I have never felt this way about anyone before. From the moment I saw you standing on that porch, something in me just knew. I do not believe in coincidence, Grace. I think I was meant to come here, meant to meet you." "You cannot say things like that," Grace whispered, but she did not step away. "Why not?" Garrett asked. "Why can I not tell you that I think you are beautiful? That I love the way you hum when you cook, the way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you are concentrating on something? That I admire your strength, your kindness, even when you are trying so hard to keep everyone at a distance?" "Because I am broken," Grace said, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to let someone in again." Garrett reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. "You are not broken, Grace. You are healing, and healing takes time. I am not asking you to be ready right now. I am just asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, you deserve to be happy again. You deserve to be loved the way you should have been loved all along." Grace looked up at him, this man who had walked into her life just a few weeks ago and somehow managed to crack open the shell she had built around her heart. "I am scared," she admitted. "I know," Garrett said softly. "But I am not going anywhere. I will wait as long as it takes." He did not kiss her, though Grace could see in his eyes that he wanted to. Instead, he took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and they stood there in the fading light, connected by the simple touch that somehow meant everything. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, not speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the front porch, Garrett finally released her hand, but not before bringing it to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Grace," he said. "Good night," she whispered back, watching as he disappeared inside and up the stairs to his room. Grace stood on the porch for a long time after he was gone, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched her skin. Something had shifted tonight, something fundamental and frightening and exhilarating all at once. For the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included more than just existing. She allowed herself to hope. Over the following weeks, Grace and Garrett grew closer, though Grace was careful not to rush things. Garrett respected her pace, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. They spent their evenings together, sometimes walking through town, sometimes sitting on the front porch and talking until the stars came out. Garrett told her about his childhood in Colorado, about growing up on a ranch and learning to ride before he could properly walk. He told her about his mother's laugh and his father's steady presence, about his little sister who had loved to sing. He spoke about them with joy rather than just sadness, celebrating the time he had with them rather than only mourning their loss. "I used to be angry," he admitted one night as they sat on the porch swing he had built and installed just the week before. "After they died, I was so angry at the world, at God, at everything. I spent 2 years just drifting, drinking too much, getting into fights. But then one day, I was sitting by a campfire somewhere in New Mexico, and I realized I was wasting the life they never got to finish. I was disrespecting their memory by throwing away what they had given me, so I decided to change." "How?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. "I started looking for the good instead of the bad. I started helping people instead of just looking out for myself. I started living with purpose instead of just trying to make it through each day." He turned to look at her. "And I promised myself that when I found something worth fighting for, something worth staying for, I would not run from it." Grace felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "Is that what this is?" she asked quietly. "Something worth staying for?" "Yes," Garrett said without hesitation. "You are worth staying for, Grace. You are worth everything." This time, when he leaned in to kiss her, Grace did not pull away. His lips were soft and warm against hers, and the kiss was gentle, questioning, giving her the space to pull back if she wanted to. But Grace did not want to pull back. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to feel alive again. When they finally broke apart, Grace was breathless, her heart racing in her chest. Garrett rested his forehead against hers, his hand cupping her cheek. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it is fast, and I know you might not be ready to say it back, but I need you to know." "I love you, Grace Abbott." Grace closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief, of joy, of a heart that was learning to open again. "I think," she said slowly, "that I might love you too. It terrifies me, but I think I do." Garrett smiled, that beautiful, genuine smile that had been slowly breaking down her walls since the day they met. "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." They sat on the porch swing until late into the night, wrapped in each other's arms, talking about everything and nothing. Grace felt a peace she had not experienced in years, a sense of rightness that had been missing from her life for so long. As spring turned to summer, Grace and Garrett's relationship deepened. They were careful about propriety, mindful of the gossip that could spread through a small town like Bannack. Grace was acutely aware of her reputation as a respectable widow, and Garrett respected that. But everyone in town could see the change in Grace, the way she smiled more, the way she seemed to glow with happiness. "I have never seen you like this," Mary Peterson said one morning when Grace stopped by the general store for supplies. Mary was the closest thing Grace had to a friend in Bannack, a kind woman in her 40s who ran the store with her husband. "That young man who is staying with you, he is good for you." Grace felt herself blush. "We are just friends," she said, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. Mary laughed. "Friends do not look at each other the way you two do. I have seen you walking together in the evenings. There is nothing wrong with finding happiness again, Grace. Thomas would want you to be happy." Would he? Grace wondered. She had spent so long feeling guilty for even considering moving on, as if loving someone new would somehow dishonor Thomas's memory. But the truth was, Thomas had been gone for 4 years. The world had kept turning, and Grace had kept living, even if she had not been truly alive. "It is complicated," Grace said finally. "Love always is," Mary replied, placing a hand over Grace's. "But it is worth it. Do not let fear keep you from living, sweetie." Those words stayed with Grace as she walked back to the boarding house, her arms full of supplies. When she arrived, she found Garrett waiting on the porch, holding a bouquet of wildflowers he had clearly picked himself. "I saw these on my way back from the mine and thought of you," he said, offering them to her with a slightly bashful expression that made her heart melt. Grace took the flowers, breathing in their sweet scent. "Thank you," she said softly. "They are beautiful." "So are you," Garrett said, and there was such sincerity in his voice that Grace felt her eyes water. That evening, after Henry had gone to bed, Grace and Garrett sat at the kitchen table, the wildflowers between them in a jar of water. Grace had been thinking all day about what Mary had said, about not letting fear keep her from living. "Garrett," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand, "I need to tell you something." He squeezed her hand gently. "What is it?" "I have been afraid for so long," Grace said, the words coming slowly but steadily. "Afraid of losing someone again, afraid of getting hurt, afraid of feeling too much. After Thomas died, I built these walls around my heart, and I convinced myself that I was protecting myself. But really, I was just hiding. I was just existing, not living." "Grace, let me finish," she said, and he nodded, his blue eyes never leaving her face. "You have changed everything. You have shown me that I can feel again, that I can want things again." You have made me realize that what I had with Thomas, as much as I tried to convince myself it was some great love story, it was not. It was comfortable, it was safe, but it was not what love should be. What I feel for you, it is different. It is bigger and scarier and more real than anything I have ever experienced, and I do not want to waste any more time being afraid. Garrett stood up and came around the table, pulling Grace to her feet and into his arms. "What are you saying?" he asked, though she could see in his eyes that he already knew. "I am saying I love you," Grace said, her voice strong and sure. "I love you, Garrett Dawson, and I want a future with you. I want to live again, really live, and I want to do it with you." Garrett kissed her then, deep and passionate, pouring all his feelings into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. Grace pulled back slightly, her eyes wide. "What?" "Marry me," Garrett repeated, taking both her hands in his. "I know it seems fast and we can have a long engagement if you want, but I know in my heart that you are the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. I love you, Grace. I love your strength and your kindness and your courage. I love the way you hum when you cook, and the way you tuck your hair behind your ear. I love everything about you, and I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life knowing that I get to spend another day with you. So please, say you will marry me." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling, really smiling, with a joy that bubbled up from deep inside her. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." Garrett let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he finally set her down, he kissed her again, softer this time, full of promise and love. "I do not have a ring yet," he said, looking slightly embarrassed. "But I will get you one, the prettiest one I can find." "I do not need a ring," Grace said, cupping his face in her hands. "I just need you." They stayed up late that night making plans for their future. Garrett wanted to buy a piece of land outside town, build a house for them. Grace loved the idea, already imagining a home filled with love and laughter, so different from the lonely existence she had been living. "How many children do you want?" Garrett asked, his arm around her shoulders as they sat on the porch swing. Grace, who had never allowed herself to think about children after Thomas died, found herself actually considering the question. "2 or 3, maybe," she said. "What about you?" "As many as you want to give me," Garrett said, kissing her temple. "I always wanted a big family. Growing up with just one sister, I sometimes wished I had more siblings." "Well then," Grace said, snuggling closer to him, "I guess we will just have to see what happens." The next morning, Grace woke up feeling lighter than she had in years. She hummed as she made breakfast, her engagement to Garrett making everything seem brighter and more hopeful. When Garrett came down for breakfast, he greeted her with a kiss that made her blush, especially when Henry walked in and cleared his throat loudly. "Sorry, Henry," Garrett said, not looking sorry at all. "Grace and I are getting married." Henry, who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, actually smiled. "About time," he said. "Congratulations." Word spread through Bannock quickly, as it always did in small towns. By the afternoon, half a dozen women had stopped by the boarding house to congratulate Grace and get a look at the man who had captured her heart. Grace endured their questions with patience, though she found their curiosity somewhat overwhelming. The one visitor she was genuinely happy to see was Mary Peterson, who arrived with a basket of fresh bread and a warm hug. "I am so happy for you," Mary said, settling into a chair in Grace's kitchen. "I knew there was something special between you two. When is the wedding?" "We have not set a date yet," Grace admitted. "Everything happened so fast. He only proposed last night." Mary laughed. "Well, when you know, you know. My husband proposed to me after 3 weeks and we have been married for 22 years. Sometimes the heart knows what the mind takes longer to figure out. Grace nodded, appreciating Mary's wisdom. I just want it to be simple, she said. Nothing fancy, just something meaningful. That sounds perfect, Mary said. Let me know if you need any help with planning. I am happy to assist however I can. After Mary left, Grace sat at her kitchen table, looking around the boarding house that had been her home and her prison for the past 4 years. She had been so stuck here, so caught in her grief and loneliness. But now, everything was changing. She was changing, and it felt wonderful. That evening, Garrett came home early from the mine with news. I talked to my foreman today, he said, his eyes bright with excitement. I told him I was getting married and planning to stay in Bannack. He said there might be an opportunity for me to move into a supervisor position. It would mean better pay, steadier work. That is wonderful, Grace said, throwing her arms around him. I also stopped by the land office, Garrett continued. There is a nice piece of property about 2 miles outside town, near the creek. It has good water, decent soil for a garden, and plenty of space to build. I am going to look at it tomorrow. Will you come with me? Grace nodded enthusiastically. The idea of having her own home, a place she and Garrett would build together, filled her with excitement. The next day was Sunday, which meant no work for either of them. They borrowed a horse and wagon from the livery and rode out to see the land. It was beautiful, nestled in a small valley with the creek running along one edge and mountains rising in the distance. Wildflowers dotted the meadow, and a stand of aspen trees provided shade near where a house could be built. What do you think? Garrett asked, helping Grace down from the wagon. Grace walked across the land, imagining a house here, a barn there, maybe a vegetable garden near the creek where the soil would be richest. She could picture children running through the meadow, their laughter echoing across the valley. She could picture growing old with Garrett here, building a life that was full and meaningful. I think it is perfect, she said, turning to smile at him. Absolutely perfect. Garrett pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that took her breath away. Then this is where we will build our life together, he said. This is where we will raise our family and grow old together. They spent the afternoon walking the property, planning where everything would go. Garrett had some experience with construction from his years working ranches, and he was confident he could build them a solid house with help from some of the men in town. Grace was already planning the layout of her kitchen, the placement of windows to catch the morning light. As the sun began to set, they sat by the creek, Grace leaning against Garrett's chest as he held her close. I never thought I could be this happy, Grace admitted quietly. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my days alone, just going through the motions. But it was not over, Garrett said, echoing the words he had spoken to her that night at the cemetery. It was just beginning. Grace turned to look up at him, seeing all the love and promise in his eyes. Yes, she agreed. It was just beginning. They set the wedding date for August, giving them time to prepare, but not so long that it felt like an eternity. Grace sold the boarding house to a couple from Virginia City who were looking to settle in Bannack. With the money from the sale and Garrett's savings, they purchased the land and began making plans for their house. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity. Garrett spent his days working at the mine and his evenings at the property, starting work on their house with help from several men in town who had volunteered their assistance. Grace packed up her belongings from the boarding house and spent her time sewing curtains and linens for their new home. Mary Peterson took Grace under her wing, helping her plan the wedding and sewing her a beautiful dress from cream-colored cotton. It was simple but elegant, with lace trim at the collar and sleeves that Mary had painstakingly added by hand. "You are going to be the most beautiful bride Bannack has ever seen," Mary said as Grace tried on the dress for a final fitting. Grace looked at herself in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at her. She was glowing, her eyes bright with happiness, her face relaxed and peaceful in a way it had not been in years. This was not the same broken woman who had been just existing 4 months ago. This was someone new, someone who had learned to hope again. The night before the wedding, Grace stayed with Mary and her husband while Garrett stayed at the new house, which was nearly finished. It was tradition for the bride and groom not to see each other before the ceremony, and though Grace missed him, she appreciated the time to reflect on how far she had come. "Are you nervous?" Mary asked as they sat up late, sipping tea in Mary's cozy kitchen. "A little," Grace admitted. "Not about marrying Garrett. I am absolutely certain about that. But it is such a big change, you know. A few months ago I was alone and convinced I would always be alone, and now I am about to start a whole new life." "Change can be scary," Mary said wisely, "but it can also be wonderful. And from what I have seen, Garrett is a good man who loves you very much. You two are going to have a beautiful life together." Grace smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "I think so too." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the Montana sky a brilliant blue without a cloud in sight. The ceremony was held at the small church in town, with most of Bannack's residents in attendance. Grace had not expected so many people to come, but it seemed the whole town wanted to celebrate with them. Grace stood at the back of the church in her cream-colored dress, holding a bouquet of wildflowers that Garrett had picked for her that morning and left with Mary. Her hands were shaking slightly, but it was from excitement rather than fear. When the music started, and she began walking down the aisle, her eyes found Garrett immediately. He was standing at the altar in his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, and the look on his face when he saw her took her breath away. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like he could not believe his luck that she had agreed to marry him. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes as she walked toward him, toward her future, toward the life she had never dared to dream she could have again. When she reached the altar and took his hands, Garrett leaned in and whispered, "You are so beautiful." The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. The pastor spoke about love and commitment, about building a life together through good times and bad. When it came time for the vows, Garrett's voice was strong and sure. "I, Garrett Dawson, take you, Grace Abbott, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to be your partner, your best friend, and your support through whatever life brings us. I promise to make you laugh, to hold you when you cry, and to remind you every single day how much you are loved." Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she spoke her own vows. "I, Grace Abbott, take you, Garrett Dawson, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you with all my heart, to stand by your side through whatever challenges we face, and to build a life with you that is full of joy and meaning. You showed me that love was not over, that it was just beginning, and I promise to spend every day showing you how grateful I am that you walked into my life." When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife and told Garrett he could kiss his bride, Garrett pulled Grace into his arms and kissed her deeply, not caring that the whole town was watching. Grace kissed him back with all the love in her heart, feeling like she was finally, truly home. The reception was held at the Peterson store, which Mary had decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. There was food and music and dancing, and Grace found herself laughing more than she had in years. She danced with Garrett, with Mary's husband, with several of the miners who worked with Garrett, feeling light and free and impossibly happy. As the sun began to set, Garrett and Grace said their goodbyes and rode out to their new house in the wagon. The house was finished enough to be livable, with a solid roof, 4 walls, and basic furniture that Garrett had built himself. It was not fancy, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. Garrett carried Grace over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the main room. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over everything. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dawson," Garrett said, cupping her face in his hands. "Mrs. Dawson," Grace repeated, trying out the name. "I like the sound of that." Garrett kissed her softly, then deeper, and Grace felt desire stir within her. She had been intimate with Thomas, of course, but it had always been quick and somewhat awkward, more about fulfilling an obligation than actual passion. She had a feeling things with Garrett would be very different. She was right. Garrett took his time, treating her with such tenderness and care that Grace felt cherished in a way she never had before. He told her she was beautiful, told her he loved her, made her feel like the most precious thing in the world. When they finally came together, it was with a connection that went beyond the physical, a joining of not just bodies but hearts and souls. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their new bed, Grace's head resting on Garrett's chest as he ran his fingers through her hair. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Garrett replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For showing me that I could live again. For loving me even when I was too afraid to love you back." Garrett tightened his arms around her. "Grace, loving you is the easiest thing I have ever done. You are worth everything." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Grace slept more peacefully than she had in years. Life as Mrs. Garrett Dawson was everything Grace had hoped it would be and more. They settled into their new house, making it a home with small touches and shared memories. Garrett continued working at the mine, eventually getting that supervisor position he had mentioned, which came with better pay and more reasonable hours. Grace planted a large vegetable garden near the creek and began taking in sewing work from women in town, earning a little money of her own. But more than the work or the house, or the practical aspects of building a life together, it was the small moments that Grace treasured most. The way Garrett always kissed her goodbye before leaving for work and hello when he came home. The way they cooked dinner together in the evenings, laughing and talking about their days. The way they sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, content in each other's presence. By October, Grace realized she had not gotten her monthly courses in 2 months. She waited another week to be sure before telling Garrett, her heart pounding with excitement and nervousness. She planned the revelation carefully, making his favorite meal and wearing the blue dress he loved. When Garrett came home from work, he immediately noticed something was different. "What is going on?" he asked, looking around at the special meal. "Did I forget an important day?" Grace laughed, shaking her head. "No, nothing like that. I just wanted tonight to be special." "Why?" Garrett asked, coming to stand in front of her and taking her hands. Grace looked up at him, barely able to contain her smile. "Because I have news. Good news." Garrett's eyes widened. "Grace, are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am pregnant," Grace confirmed and watched as joy spread across Garrett's face. "Really?" he asked, pulling her close. "We are going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby," Grace repeated, laughing as Garrett picked her up and spun her around. "I am going to be a father," Garrett said, his voice filled with wonder. "We are going to be parents." He set her down gently, suddenly concerned. "Are you all right? Should you be standing? Do you need to sit down?" Grace laughed at his sudden nervousness. "I am fine, Garrett. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am not made of glass." But Garrett was not to be dissuaded. From that moment on, he treated Grace like she was the most delicate, precious thing in the world. He insisted on doing all the heavy work around the house, would not let her lift anything heavier than a dish, and worried constantly about her health. Grace found it both endearing and slightly frustrating, but she could not be too annoyed when she saw how excited Garrett was about the baby. He spent his evenings building a cradle, sanding and finishing the wood, until it was smooth as silk. He talked to her belly even when she was barely showing, telling their unborn child stories and promising to be the best father he could be. Winter came to Montana, bringing snow and cold that kept them inside more often than not. But Grace did not mind. She loved these quiet evenings with Garrett, sitting by the fire while he worked on baby clothes and she sewed tiny blankets. They talked about names and argued playfully about whether the baby would have Grace's honey-colored hair or Garrett's dark curls. "I hope the baby has your eyes," Grace said one evening, reaching over to touch Garrett's face. "Those beautiful blue eyes." "I hope the baby has your smile," Garrett countered, kissing her palm, "and your kind heart." As spring returned and Grace's belly grew rounder, their excitement grew as well. Mary Peterson became a frequent visitor, bringing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes from her own children, who were now grown. She taught Grace what to expect during labor and birth, helping to ease some of Grace's nervousness about the process. "You will do fine," Mary assured her. "You are strong and you have a husband who loves you. That is more than many women have." Grace knew Mary was right. She was so blessed, so incredibly lucky to have found Garrett and to have this second chance at happiness. Sometimes she thought about Thomas, but not with grief or guilt anymore. She could remember the good times without it hurting, and she hoped that wherever he was, he would be happy that she had found love again. In early May of 1877, just over a year after Garrett had first arrived in Bannack, Grace went into labor. It was early morning, and Garrett immediately went into a panic, rushing around the house trying to gather everything while Grace calmly told him to fetch Mary and the doctor. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 18 hours. Garrett stayed by Grace's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, telling her how strong she was and how much he loved her. When Grace was exhausted and ready to give up, it was Garrett's voice that gave her the strength to keep going. "You can do this," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Just a little more, my love. Just a little more." And finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their baby entered the world with a loud, healthy cry. The doctor placed the baby in Grace's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face, feeling a love so overwhelming it took her breath away. "It is a boy," the doctor announced, smiling. "A healthy, strong boy." Grace looked up at Garrett, who had tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "A boy," he whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "We have a son." They named him Thomas Garrett Dawson, honoring both the past and the present. Little Thomas had Grace's honey-colored hair and what looked like it might be Garrett's blue eyes, though it was too early to tell for sure. He was perfect in every way, and both Grace and Garrett fell completely in love with him the moment he was born. The days and weeks after Thomas's birth were exhausting but wonderful. Grace had never felt so tired in her life, but she also had never felt so happy. Garrett was an incredible father, attentive and gentle with their son. He would wake up in the night to help with feedings, walking Thomas around the house and singing to him in a low, soothing voice. Grace would watch them together, her heart so full of love it felt like it might burst. This was what she had been missing all those years, this sense of family and belonging and purpose. This was what love was supposed to feel like. As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, Grace and Garrett's love for each other only deepened. They had their challenges, of course. There were sleepless nights and money worries and the normal disagreements that all couples had. But they faced everything together, always choosing each other, always choosing love. When Thomas was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time, she knew what to expect and she was less nervous. Garrett was no less protective, but he had learned to trust that Grace knew her own body and what she could handle. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Grace Dawson, was born in the fall of 1879. She had Garrett's dark curls and Grace's green eyes, and she was as different from Thomas as could be. Where Thomas was calm and serious, Sarah was loud and adventurous. She kept them on their toes constantly, and Grace often laughed that she should have known any daughter of Garrett's would be fearless. Life was full and busy and sometimes chaotic, but it was also beautiful. Grace looked around at the life she and Garrett had built together and felt nothing but gratitude. The boarding house in Bannack, that lonely existence she had been living, seemed like a lifetime ago. That woman who thought love was over, who believed she would spend the rest of her days alone, felt like a stranger. This was who Grace was meant to be. A wife, a mother, a woman who was loved and who loved fiercely in return. This was the life she was meant to live. On their 5th wedding anniversary in August of 1881, Garrett surprised Grace by taking her back to the spot where he had proposed, near the cemetery where they had stood that first evening. It was sunset, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, just like it had been that night. "I wanted to bring you back here," Garrett said, holding both of Grace's hands. "To the place where everything changed." Grace looked around, remembering standing here 5 years ago, broken and lonely, convinced that the best part of her life was behind her. And then Garrett had said those words that changed everything. "I think it is just beginning." "You were right," Grace said, looking up at her husband. "That night when you said love was not over for me, that it was just beginning, you were so right." "We were both right," Garrett said, pulling her close. "Because this is just the beginning for us, Grace. We have so many more years ahead of us, so many more memories to make, so much more life to live together." Grace kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into that kiss. "I love you, Garrett Dawson. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for showing me that it was possible to live again." "I love you too," Garrett said. "Thank you for taking a chance on a drifter cowboy who showed up on your porch one day. Thank you for being brave enough to open your heart again." They stood there as the sun set, holding each other close, thinking about how far they had come and how much further they still had to go together. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and challenges. In 1883, Grace gave birth to their third child, another son they named Henry James Dawson. He was a happy, easy baby who slept through the night almost from the beginning, which Grace considered a small miracle after the sleepless nights she had endured with Thomas and Sarah. Garrett's career at the mine continued to flourish, and he eventually became the head supervisor, overseeing all the operations. The increased income allowed them to expand their house, adding more rooms for their growing family, and even installing some of the modern conveniences that were becoming available. Grace continued her sewing work, though she was selective about the projects she took on, wanting to prioritize time with her children. She also became involved in the church, helping to organize community events and supporting new families who moved to Bannack. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, intelligent boy who loved books and learning. Grace taught him to read at a young age, and he would spend hours poring over any book he could get his hands on. Garrett was endlessly proud of his oldest son, though he sometimes worried that Thomas was too serious for a child. "Let him be who he is," Grace would say gently. "Not everyone has to be outgoing and adventurous." Sarah, on the other hand, was adventurous enough for all of them. She climbed trees, chased after her father when he went to work, and declared at the age of 4 that she was going to be a cowboy when she grew up. Garrett adored her spirit, while Grace tried to instill at least some sense of propriety in her wild daughter. Little Henry was still too young to show much personality, but he was a sweet, cuddly baby who loved being held and seemed content just to be near his family. In the spring of 1885, Grace discovered she was pregnant for the 4th time. She was 33 years old now, and while she was happy about the baby, she also felt more tired than she had with her previous pregnancies. Garrett noticed immediately and insisted she rest more, taking on even more of the household duties. "I am fine," Grace protested. "I have done this 3 times before. And this time, I am making sure you take care of yourself," Garrett said firmly. "I am not taking any chances with you." Grace could not help but smile at his protectiveness. Even after nearly 9 years of marriage, Garrett still treated her like she was precious, still told her every day that he loved her, still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. She knew how rare that was, how blessed she was to have found this kind of love. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in November of 1885, Grace gave birth to another daughter, whom they named Margaret Rose Dawson. She was tiny and delicate, with wisps of honey-colored hair and big blue eyes that seemed to take in everything. With 4 children now, life was busier than ever. Grace and Garrett had to work hard to find time for just the 2 of them, but they made it a priority. Once a month, Mary would watch the children so Grace and Garrett could have an evening alone, either taking a walk or just sitting on their porch and talking like they used to when they were first falling in love. "You ever miss the quiet?" Grace asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset. From inside the house, they could hear Sarah arguing with Thomas about something and Henry crying. Garrett laughed and pulled Grace closer. "Not even a little bit. This life, chaotic as it is everything I ever wanted. A full house, a beautiful wife, healthy children. I am the luckiest man alive." "I am pretty lucky too," Grace said, resting her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I could be this happy. There was a time when I was convinced that happiness was not in the cards for me anymore." "But you were wrong," Garrett said, kissing the top of her head. "Happiness was always waiting for you. You just had to be brave enough to reach for it." Grace nodded, thinking about that day nearly 10 years ago when Garrett had ridden into Bannack and changed her life forever. She had been standing in a cemetery, surrounded by death and the past, unable to see any kind of future. And then this man had come along and shown her that the future could be bright, that love could be real and lasting and worth the risk. The years continued to pass in a blur of birthday parties and school recitals and family dinners. Thomas grew into a serious young man who dreamed of becoming a teacher. Sarah mellowed slightly as she got older, though she never lost her adventurous spirit. Henry was quiet and artistic, always drawing or building something with his hands. And little Margaret was the baby of the family, sweet and somewhat spoiled by her older siblings. In 1890, when Grace was 38 years old, they welcomed their 5th and final child, a son they named William Grant Dawson. He was a surprise baby, as Grace had assumed she was done having children, but he was no less loved for being unexpected. Garrett, now 40 years old, joked that he was getting too old for sleepless nights, but Grace could see how much he adored their new son. William was a happy, easy baby who seemed to fit perfectly into their family. Life was full and rich, and everything Grace had never dared to dream of all those years ago. She and Garrett had built something beautiful together, something lasting. They had created not just a family, but a legacy of love that would continue for generations. In 1895, as they celebrated their 14th wedding anniversary, Grace and Garrett took a walk to the land where their house stood, remembering when it had been just an empty meadow full of wildflowers and possibilities. "Look at everything we have built," Grace said, gesturing at the house that had been expanded and improved over the years, at the barn where they kept horses and chickens, at the garden that produced vegetables all summer long, at the children playing in the yard. "We did this together," Garrett said. "Every bit of it." Grace turned to look at her husband, noticing the gray that was starting to appear at his temples, the lines around his eyes from years of smiling. He was as handsome to her now as he had been that first day she saw him riding into town, maybe even more so because of everything they had been through together. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you more now than I did the day we got married, and I did not think that was possible." "I love you too," Garrett said, pulling her close. "You are my everything, Grace. My whole world." They kissed there in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and the sound of their children's laughter, and Grace felt a peace so complete it brought tears to her eyes. As the 19th century drew to a close and they entered the new century together, Grace and Garrett watched their children grow and find their own paths in life. Thomas did become a teacher, getting a position at the school in Bannack, and eventually marrying a sweet young woman named Elizabeth. Sarah, true to her adventurous nature, moved to Denver and started a business organizing trail rides, scandalizing some of the more traditional folks in Bannack, but making her parents proud nonetheless. Henry showed a talent for carpentry and began working with Garrett at the mine, designing and building equipment. Margaret was still young, but she showed an interest in medicine and talked about becoming a nurse. And William, the baby of the family, was still finding his way, but he had time. Grace and Garrett became grandparents in 1902 when Thomas and Elizabeth had a son. Holding her grandson for the first time, Grace felt the circle of life complete itself in a beautiful way. She thought about Thomas Abbott, her first husband, whom this little boy was partly named after. She hoped that wherever Thomas was, he could see how his legacy had continued, how his name lived on in this new generation. But she also knew that the life she had now, the love she had found with Garrett, was something entirely different from what she had known before. This was the kind of love that songs were written about, the kind that lasted through everything life could throw at it. In the summer of 1906, Grace and Garrett celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a big party, inviting everyone they had known over the years. The whole town of Bannack turned out to celebrate the couple who had become something of a legend, the widowed boarding house keeper and the drifter cowboy, who had found love when neither of them was looking for it. Mary Peterson, now in her 70s and still as sharp as ever, gave a toast at the party. "I remember when Grace used to come into my store and she looked like a ghost," Mary said, "just going through the motions of living without really being alive. And then this young man came to town, and everything changed. He reminded her what it meant to truly live, what it meant to love and be loved. Their story gives all of us hope that it is never too late to start over, never too late to find happiness." Grace felt tears streaming down her face as everyone raised their glasses. She looked at Garrett, who was also emotional, and squeezed his hand. "Would you like to say anything?" Mary asked them. Garrett stood, pulling Grace up with him. "25 years ago, I rode into Bannack looking for work," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I had no idea I was about to meet the woman who would change my life forever. Grace, You were hurting and lost, convinced that love was over for you. But I saw something in you that you could not see in yourself. I saw strength and beauty and a heart that was ready to heal, even if you did not know it yet. I told you that night that love was not over for you, that it was just beginning, and I was right. But what I did not know then was that it was just beginning for me too. You have given me everything, a home, a family, a purpose. You have made me the happiest man alive, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat. He turned to Grace, cupping her face in his hands. I love you more today than I did 25 years ago, and I will love you even more 25 years from now. You are my heart, my soul, my everything. Grace was crying openly now, not caring who saw. And you are mine, she said. You saved me, Garrett. You reminded me what it meant to live. I was drowning in grief and loneliness, and you pulled me out. You showed me that the best part of my life was not behind me but ahead of me. Every day with you has been a gift, and I am so grateful for all of it. They kissed, and the whole crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Their children were crying, and even some of the tough miners who worked with Garrett were wiping their eyes. The party continued late into the night, with music and dancing and stories about Grace and Garrett's years together. As the evening wound down and guests started heading home, Grace and Garrett stood on their porch, watching the stars come out over the Montana mountains. 25 years, Grace said wonderingly. It has gone by so fast. And we have many more ahead of us, Garrett said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Many more anniversaries to celebrate, many more grandchildren to meet, many more sunsets to watch together. Grace leaned back against him, feeling his solid presence, his unwavering love. Do you remember what you said to me that first night we really talked, when I told you I did not know how to live anymore? I said maybe you could learn if you wanted to, Garrett recalled. And I did learn, Grace said. You taught me. You showed me that it was possible to feel again, to hope again, to love again. You gave me back my life. No, Garrett said, turning her around to face him. You gave yourself back your life. I just reminded you that you could. You did all the hard work, Grace. You were brave enough to take the risk, brave enough to open your heart again. I am just lucky enough to be the one you chose to share it with. They stood there for a long time, holding each other under the stars, thinking about all the years behind them and all the years still to come. Their love had started with pain and loss, but it had grown into something beautiful and lasting. They had built a life together that was full of joy and meaning, and they had done it by choosing each other every single day. As they finally went inside and got ready for bed, Grace felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. She looked at Garrett, this man who had changed everything, and felt nothing but gratitude and love. They had proven that it was never too late to start over, never too late to find love, never too late to build a life worth living. Grace had thought love was over, but Garrett had shown her that it was just beginning. And what a beautiful beginning it had been. In the years that followed, Grace and Garrett continued to enjoy their life together, surrounded by their children and growing number of grandchildren. They faced the challenges of aging with grace and humor, supporting each other through illnesses and losses, always choosing to focus on the good rather than the bad. Garrett eventually retired from the mine in 1910, at the age of 60. They spent their days working in their garden, playing with their grandchildren, and enjoying the simple pleasures of a life well lived. Grace continued to sew, though now mostly for her grandchildren, making quilts and clothes that would be treasured for generations. In 1915, as they approached their 34th anniversary, Grace fell ill with pneumonia. Garrett never left her side, holding her hand through the worst of it, refusing to believe that he might lose her. Grace fought hard, drawing strength from Garrett's presence, and slowly recovered. "You are not getting rid of me that easily," she joked weakly when she was finally on the mend. "I have no intention of letting you go," Garrett replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We still have too many more years together." And they did have more years, precious years that they cherished all the more for knowing how close they had come to losing each other. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1921, surrounded by 5 children, 13 grandchildren, and the love and respect of everyone who knew them. Grace was 69 years old now, and Garrett was 71. They moved a little slower, their hair was completely gray, and their bodies sometimes ached in ways they never had when they were young. But the love between them had not diminished at all. If anything, it had grown deeper and richer with time. They still sat on their porch every evening watching the sun set over the mountains. They still held hands when they walked through town. They still told each other, "I love you," every single day. Their love had become the stuff of legend in Bannack, the story that mothers told their daughters about what true love looked like. On a beautiful spring day in 1925, just before their 44th anniversary, Grace and Garrett took one final walk to the meadow where their house stood. The wildflowers were blooming, painting the landscape in brilliant colors, and the mountains stood majestic in the distance. "This is where it all began," Grace said, looking around at the land they had loved for so many years. "This is where we built our life." "And what a life it has been," Garrett said, his arm around her shoulders. "No regrets, Grace. Not a single one." "No regrets," Grace agreed. "Only gratitude. Gratitude for every day I got to spend with you, for every moment of love and laughter, for every challenge we faced together." "You gave me everything, Garrett. And you gave me everything right back," Garrett said, kissing her temple. "I love you, Grace Dawson. I have loved you from the moment I first saw you standing on that porch, and I will love you for whatever time we have left and beyond." "I love you too," Grace said, tears running down her weathered cheeks. "Thank you for showing me that it was just beginning." They stood there in the meadow, two people who had found each other when they both needed it most, who had built a beautiful life together through love and commitment, and choosing each other every single day. Their story was proof that it was never too late to start over, never too late to find happiness, never too late to learn to truly live. Grace lived to be 78 years old, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1934 with Garrett holding her hand. Garrett followed her just 6 months later, unable to imagine a life without his beloved Grace. They were buried side by side in the Bannack Cemetery, not far from where Thomas Abbott was buried, the place where their story had really begun all those years ago. Their children made sure their headstone told their story, Grace and Garrett Dawson. She thought love was over. He said it was just beginning. And together, they proved that love never truly ends. The house they built still stood in the meadow, lived in by various descendants over the years, a monument to what they had created together. The wildflowers still bloomed every spring, painting the landscape in brilliant colors, a reminder of the beauty that can grow from pain, the hope that can emerge from despair, and the love that can flourish when two hearts are brave enough to take the risk. Their great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren still told their story, passing it down through the generations as a reminder that it is never too late to start over, never too late to find love, never too late to choose life over mere existence. Grace and Garrett's legacy was not just the family they created, but the example they set. That love, real and lasting and true, was always worth fighting for. And somewhere, perhaps in those Montana mountains they loved so much, perhaps in the wildflowers that bloomed every spring, perhaps in the hearts of every person who had been touched by their story, Grace and Garrett's love lived on. because love like theirs never truly ends. It just transforms, growing and evolving and inspiring new generations to be brave enough to open their hearts, to take the risk, to believe that even when it seems like love is over, it might just be beginning.